Hey, Life Group leaders, thanks for joining us. Today we've got a special guest. Stu is going to lead us through this chapter and share some thoughts on what he studied, and I'm excited about that. It's a wonderful chapter, and Stu's going to let us know that most people want to concentrate on just two verses, those last two verses of the chapter. But there's a whole lot more to the chapter than just those last couple verses. And so we're just going to start and kind of walk through it together. This is Stu's first time, and so I'm excited about that. So, Stu, if you're ready, why don't you just kick in and start us off?
Yeah, so, we're in Isaiah 40, verses 18 through 31, and the lesson we have is entitled God Renews. It does contain a couple of extremely popular verses that you see it on artwork in people's homes. You see it in Christian music. You hear it. You see it in popular movies, maybe at sporting events or things like that. It's those last couple of verses about people trusting in the Lord and renewing their strength and rising up on wings like eagles. But I don't think we often think about those verses in the context of the entire passage, which sort of speaks to the tendency of all humans to make idols in which they can try to trust and find comfort instead of finding comfort in God. So I would probably encourage you to challenge your class to consider the passage as more than just a source for an inspirational quote that you'd hang on the wall in the living room or anything like that. It's a passage that's really about the fact that God, there's only one God, one creator, one name that is worthy to be worshiped and relied upon for renewal and for strength and comfort in difficult times. And so something to remember about Isaiah, it's a book sort of in three sections. So chapters 1 through 39 really focus on Jerusalem and significant world events during the rise of the Assyrian Empire, the fall of Samaria and all that. Chapters 40 through 55 focus on a message of encouragement and comfort for those who are in exiles during the Babylonian defeat. And then chapters 56 through 66 focuses on a message of encouragement for both Israel and those God will save from all the nations of the earth as he speaks about the coming day of the Lord at the end of earthly history. So when we come to chapter 40, we begin to see this message of comfort for the faithful of God's people who are discouraged by their circumstances. And so just last week, we studied about how God defeated the Assyrians by wiping out 185,000 of their soldiers in one night. And so, however, the people of Judah were still facing the punishment of exile because of their unfaithfulness to their covenant with God. The Babylonians were going to come and defeat them and take away the people from their homeland into exile where they would be without land, king, or temple to worship at. And even as the Babylonian defeat was approaching, God is already offering comfort to the faithful ones amongst his people in this passage by reminding them that he is incomparable to anything else. There is no one else, nothing else like him. He is the creator of all things and is in control, so they can still trust in him. And so a couple of weeks back in Isaiah 37, that lesson, we read about how some of the people were wanting to run to Egypt for help when the Assyrians attacked, right? And our class stopped and talked about what are our Egypts, meaning what were the things that we run to for help besides God when we find ourselves in trouble. And these Egypts are idols in our lives. So Isaiah 40, as we enter this chapter, verses 19 through 24, opens by asking what possible idols made by man can compare with an almighty God. And it describes these idols made of silver and gold by the rich and idols made of wood by the poor. And so we see that all people make idols for themselves with whatever they have available. And all of those idols we make or worship are made of things that were created by God himself. And so this might be a good time to stop and ask your class, maybe what are some examples of idols in our modern times? I mean, they would have made things out of trees, out of wood, or the rich people might have made things out of silver and gold and things like that. But, obviously today it's different. The things that we make idols of in our lives are different. And you might ask them what some of those examples are, or what materials they might use these days, cheap or expensive or things like that. I don't know.
Just don't mention boats in that. Okay.
That's right. Right. Yeah, we don't want to step on anybody's toes.
We don't want to step on too many toes. Here.
Right. Right. But yeah, so there might be some discussion to be had there about idols, and As these verses continue, we're reminded that God is not impressed with the quality of any of our idols at all. Nothing is impressive. In fact, it's offensive, and it's so small. In fact, it says in the verses that the inhabitants of the earth are like grasshoppers, and that the princes and judges who defy him are reduced to nothing and laid waste, and that the wind blows them away like stubble. Yeah. So clearly our idols and the ungodly rulers of this world don't stand a chance of threatening God's authority. What do you think that? As we move next, we look at, it caught my attention at verse 26, where it says, "Look up and see who created these. He brings out the stars by number, and he calls them all by name because of his great power and strength. Not one of them is missing." And that kind of caught my attention, that he focused in on that number of stars. So I looked it up, what they guessed the number of stars is in the known universe, and it's found this. It says the number of stars in a galaxy varies, but assuming an average of 100 billion stars per galaxy, that means there are about 1 sextillion stars in the observable universe. So that's a 1 with 21 zeros after it. And I think Isaiah says that God calls them each by name. And I can't even imagine coming up with 1,000 names for stars, or even 100. And I think that by stating this, Isaiah is trying to give us a glimpse at the unimaginable greatness of God. His command of all creation is just beyond what we can imagine. Yeah. And so then we move on to verses 27 through 29. I think here where it says, "Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my claim is ignored by God? Do you not know, have you not heard, the Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the whole earth. He never becomes faint or weary. There is no limit to his understanding, and he gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless." And I think this is a really poignant passage for where we're at right now, where we find ourselves. Obviously, this year has been brutal for a lot of people in the world, and people have lost loved ones, they've lost jobs, they've lost homes, security, faced sickness, uncertainty about the present and the future. Every month of this year just seems to bring more challenges to most people I know. And there's a very good chance that somebody in your life group is having a difficult time simply just continuing to have hope and believe that things will even ever get better. They might be asking themselves exactly what we see here. Is essentially they're asking, has God forgotten us? Isaiah is saying that the people are questioning whether God even remembers them in their struggles. And Isaiah is quick to remind them in verse 28 that God never grows weary. I think this is an incredibly good time to stop and encourage people in your group with verse 29, where it states that God gives strength to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Maybe even just ask if anybody has been facing an extremely difficult time with things this year, and ask if they have a specific burden that they would like to share with the rest of the group to be praying for them. If someone does mention something, maybe reassure them that even if they feel powerless in their situation, God promises to give strength to them if they seek him and rest in him. So if people seem to really talk about that here, if you want a New Testament passage to go to maybe sort of parallel this, you could go to 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verses 8 through 10 and give a New Testament example. Paul says he'd been given a thorn in the flesh, and we don't really know if this was a physical affliction, an illness, a difficult person in his life, or what. We just know that there was a struggle with a difficult situation again, and Scripture states that in our weakness, God can give us strength if we trust and rest in him. So it may not be easy to do, but in fact, it may be extremely hard to do. Right. But it is our best and only true source of unending strength in life. And so then we get to the verses that everybody sort of thinks of when they think of this passage there in verses 30 and 31, where it says, "Youths may become faint and weary, and young men stumble and fall, but those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint." And so when we arrive at those verses, like I said, most people have heard them before. We're told that even young people can become weary and faint, that even young men stumble and fall. But we see the promise that if we trust in the Lord, our strength will be renewed. It says they will soar on wings like eagles. I have to admit, when I was looking over lessons to pick to do one for this fall season, this one caught my eye because I'd heard somebody explain before how it is that eagles, how they deal with a storm, and I hadn't heard that before, and somebody explained it to me, so I'll share it with you. It says, I looked it up and I read it again. It says apparently when an eagle sees a storm approaching on the horizon, it looks for a really high place on a high up tree or a perch or a cliff somewhere that it can perch, and it sits there and it waits. And then when the storm arrives, instead of vigorously flapping its wings and diving into the storm and flying for its life, it just lifts its wings out as high as it can, and it lets the force of the wind of the storm hit it and just lift it up over the approaching storm. So the intense winds provide lift, and it lets the force of the winds raise it up as the storm passes. He just sails over it. So I know our vision is not as good as that of an eagle, and we may not always see the storms coming. I can think of times in my life where I saw storms coming, and I can think of times in my life where storms just came out of nowhere, seemingly. But I think the principle holds true either way, that if we trust in our own strength to get through the storm, we're likely going to find ourselves feeling like we're drowning in the rains and the winds. But Scripture says that if we trust in the Lord and simply spread out our wings and let Him lift us up, He can carry us through the storm.
That's good.
And that doesn't mean the storm won't take a while to pass, but it does mean that God will carry us through until the rain stops. And so same here, if there's time, if you want a New Testament passage that maybe parallels this idea, maybe you could go to Matthew chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. And this was the passage I thought about immediately. Just like we see in Isaiah, Jesus is teaching, and he uses the idea of a storm coming and pounding against someone. And the one who built his or her house on the rock of Jesus and his teachings stood the storm. But the one who did not, it says, fell with a great crash. And so if you found yourself in a storm and you've suffered a great crash, I think a good encouragement to your class might be that, it doesn't mean that life is over. It just means that maybe you had built your foundation up on something other than God and His commandments. And it's not too late to seek the Lord with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and let Him help you rebuild your life on a better foundation than what you were building on. And so then when the next storm comes, if you trust in Him, you can let Him lift you up and carry you through the next storm like the eagles do, where they just spread their wings out and let the wind carry them through it instead of trying to do it in their own power. So
Great job. Great job,
sure.
Stu. Thank you. My translation in verse 31 says, yet those who wait on the Lord. Stu's translation had trust. And that's a good, toward the end of your lesson, you might throw out this question to your students. What does it mean to wait on the Lord? Of course, we know it means to be trustful of Him. But, that's a good discussion question. How do we do that? How does that shake out in our lives? Stu, good job. Let me tell you what, if I were teaching, I'm not this week, but if I were teaching, I took our text. I think it's a great text. I kind of changed the title to God Exalted. And the reason I did that is because I kind of drew together 3 points. And you may want to go this direction. You may not want to, but it might help you. Verses 18, 19, and 20, I jotted down God's sovereignty. And by the way, let me back up just a minute. Anytime there's a statement about God, then man has to respond to that. When we preach or when we teach and we say something about the mighty God or the terror of God or the anger of God or the sovereignty of God, we do that because man has to always respond in some way to that. And so what I did in verses 18 through 20, I wrote down God's sovereignty, by that meaning His omni-attributes, omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience. So what does man respond then? Well, man must respond, if he's going to be correct, respond in worship. And those verses help us in worship. My next point, verses 21 through 26, is God's revelation. These verses are really incredibly clear. Stu brought that out well about naming the stars. Think about that. I'm wondering if there's a star by the name of Bob or Tom, But God's revelation, verses 21 through 26, well, then what would be man's response to that? Well, man's responsibility, man's acknowledgement. If God is the God of creation and he is the God of revelation, then man has a responsibility to that. And I think 21 through 26 kind of fits that God's revelation, man's responsibility. And then verses 27 through 31, I wrote down God's mercy. And the reason I did that is because Isaiah is talking about pre-captivity. And he's giving encouragement, as Stu has taught us, and he's giving us a light, in a sense, out of some darkness. And yet the nation is moving toward captivity. It's about 120 years before they go away into captivity. So he's already encouraging them with some hope, which is God's mercy. And so what then is man's responsibility there? Well, man's patience. Hope is the steadfastness of believing that no matter how tough it may get, we're survivors. God's going to see to it that we survive. And so that's how probably if I were teaching, I would talk about God's sovereignty, I am to worship. God's revelation, I am to acknowledge it. God's mercy, I am to live with hope. W.A. Criswell, great pastor, First Baptist Dallas of years gone by, wrote this: the world is either a place where there is no God anywhere, or it is a place where there is God everywhere. And I think kind of what Isaiah is wanting this nation that's moving toward captivity to know is that God is everywhere, even in the storms, even in captivity, because there's something beyond captivity. In fact, Isaiah in this chapter is looking beyond the exile, beyond captivity, and even though it may be a little difficult, in some ways we might even say terrible, hope always looks beyond the moment, beyond the pressure. And so hopefully some of the things that Stu has taught us and maybe some of the things I've thrown out might help you in your study. I hope you've enjoyed the study of Isaiah. I've got to tell you, in all my years of ministry, I've enjoyed these Sunday school life group lessons as much as any text we've had, because I'm getting my head around Isaiah greater. And I've always struggled. It's such a long book. And I've always struggled a little bit along with what is he going, the context. And I just love it. You know, that first part is about judgment. There's some darkness there. He talks about restoration. Then he starts moving toward blessings. And it's just an incredible, incredible study for me personally. And I hope it's been for you in your class. And we're going to keep walking through for the next several weeks. And so have a great study. And I hope Sunday is a good day for you. And we'll be back next week to share a little bit more on this wonderful study of the book of Isaiah. Let me just kind of, you already know this, but let me just tell you how thrilled that we are to have Matt Bell and his family coming to join us on staff. I'm excited for our students. I think they're excited. We're just, I told them this week, hurry up, get here. It's time to go to work. And you're going to come to love this family. I want you to pray for them. They've got to leave some people they love. They've got to come to a new place where people they don't know to love. Let's make it easy for them. Write them, call them, text them. When you see them at church, don't expect them to know your name. You tell them your name. And you let them know, hey, man, we're praying for you. Any way I can help you, let me know. Well, God bless you.